Hi, everybody. This is Paul Reyes with CommonLook. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar, where we'll kind of review some things that we've talked about in previous webinars and focus specifically on some of the final things that you're going to take care of when you're dealing with PDF remediation, including metadata and your final verification. First of all, as usual, a little bit of housekeeping. Hopefully you can hear me okay, but you're on mute. So if you're having issues with the Zoom platform functionality and so on, please drop your questions in the chat and we will help you out the best we can. Meanwhile, if you have a question about today's content, the stuff that I'm going over in the presentation, please drop those questions in the Q&A pod and I'll be sure to check those at the end. Also, keep in mind that if we run out of time and don't get all of your questions answered, or if you come up with a question after the webinar is over, we'll provide some contact information for how you can reach out to us to get your questions answered. Also, keep in mind that this webinar is being recorded and we will send out a captioned recording to you by email, so be on the lookout for that. But also at the same time, give us a few days to get the captioning done and so on. But be on the lookout for that. It'll be on its way. So we'll kind of review some things. Like I said, today's agenda, we'll just kind of go back over, how compliant do we have to be, and talk about things like testing and how do we go about, if we're going to talk about final verification, how do we know we're done? How are we verifying things? So we'll talk briefly about some testing tools that we can use, and then take a closer look at some of the concepts that we're talking about today, especially dealing with metadata and so on. And as I mentioned, we'll open it up for questions and hopefully get you some answers. And also, as mentioned, we'll provide our contact information so that should you need to reach out to us after the fact, you will be able to do that. So oftentimes we're asked, how compliant do we have to be, right? It can be a lot of work to remediate documents and test them and test everything that needs to be tested and so on and so forth. Do we really have to do all of that, right, is a common question. I answer that this way. Think of this situation. Somebody's in a wheelchair and they're trying to get into a building and they can get 60, 70, maybe even 90% of the way up the ramp. But for whatever reason, they can't get all the way into the building. That building's not accessible. And as a result, the building owner or the business owner perhaps are at legal risk for inaccessibility. Websites and documents are right along those same lines, where if your website or the documents on your website or even other documents that you have aren't accessible, then you're possibly at legal risk for having inaccessible content, but you're also just at risk for people not being able to use the materials that you're trying to use to communicate or whatever. So long story short on that, you need to be 100% compliant with the standards, right? So that you're sure that everything has been addressed and that people can really use your content. So how do we know that we're compliant, right? You got to test. At some point, you're going to have to test. And it's important to make sure that you're using testing tools that actually test against the standards, so you know whether or not you're actually there, right? And so it's important to keep in mind that while the checker in Acrobat is called the full check, it doesn't actually test against any accessibility standards. Sure, it tests some stuff and it's better than nothing, but it does let a lot slide too. So Acrobat should not be your final go-to for how do you know your standards compliant, right? The PAC3 checker is a free PDF checker. You can Google it and download it. And it does test against PDF UA. Right, so PDF UA being the universal accessibility standard for PDF. So if your organization needs to comply with PDF UA, then PAC3 would be a good checker for you to use. Of course, there's things to keep in mind about PAC3 and Acrobat where they do let some things slide. There's some things that automation can test, but there's a lot of things in accessibility that require manual verification. And both the Acrobat full check and the PAC3 checker let some of those things slide, right? They don't prompt you on the user verification items. Another checker, the CommonLook PDF Validator, another free tool. It tests against WCAG 2.0, which of course is also known as Section 508. It also tests against WCAG 2.1, both WCAG 2.0 and 2.1 at the AA level. Also, the CommonLook PDF Validator tests against PDF UA, the ISO 32000 standard, which is literally the standard on how to make a PDF. It also tests against the HHS standard for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So if you fall under their purview, then you might want to use the CommonLook PDF Validator to make sure that you're in compliance with HHS. Of course, you want to keep in mind that every tool has its pros and cons. As I mentioned, Acrobat, PAC3, not prompting you to test some of the things that require manual verification. So you would need to be aware of that and need to remember to check those things on your own. And also, of course, every tool is going to have a learning curve, right? So you're going to have to take time to get to know the tool and how it works, what it's showing you, what it does or doesn't test, for example, and so on. Right? Also important to keep in mind, does your checker create a report? Because if you're doing the work and you're testing things, you want to be able to show that you've done the work and tested things. So it's good to be able to generate a compliance report. And also, kind of important to note, is the report accessible? I think interestingly enough, some tools will generate a compliance report, but then if you test that report, it fails. So some things to keep in mind when it comes to testing. And again, while automation is awesome, automation is going to miss some stuff, and there's always going to be some manual labor, testing, verification that is going to have to be done. So let's talk a little bit about our remediation workflow, focusing, of course, on the end of the job with the verification and so on. Right, so as we start out, we've modeled this on other webinars that we've done throughout this series. We open up the PDF and we check the tags, and we check to make sure that the correct tags are being used for the content, and we check to make sure that then they're in the correct order, right? Because as we've discussed previously, the reading order in a PDF is determined by the order of the content in the tags tree. So we want to make sure that the correct tags are being used for the content and they're in the correct order. We also want to make sure that other considerations are being addressed. For example, when you have images, not only are the images placed in a figure tag, but do the figure tags have accurate alternative text? Are the tables tagged correctly? Not only in a table, but have the headers been set with their scope, and so on. And lists, right? We talked about lists recently, talking about list numbering, and do we need the label tags and stuff like that in our list, but making sure that our lists are tagged correctly. And then adding the document tag at the end, probably, perhaps, of the remediation process, certainly before you think you're done, to just kind of wrap things up and say, this is one full and complete document. So other things that come into play when it comes to PDF accessibility, remediation, testing, checking the metadata, right? So the metadata is literally data about the PDF, right? And so what's included in the metadata, title, author, subject, keywords, the language is also often addressed as a metadata component as well. So making sure that these things are set. Now, what's required by the standards versus what's a nice to have? That actually varies depending on which standard we're talking about. So every accessibility standard is going to require that your PDF has a title and that the title is set to be displayed so that when somebody opens up the PDF, the title is what's shown instead of the file name, right? Those are kind of your two options. That's required that you have a title. The author, subject, and keywords, those are nice to haves by most standards, right? So keywords particularly are helpful when you're posting your document online. You want to make it easier for people to find. Keywords help out with that. Another requirement in the metadata is that the language is set for the document, so that, for example, if you have a document in English, the language is set to English so that a screen reader is going to see that and say, hey, I need to read this in English. Whereas if the language was set incorrectly, you've got text that's written in English, but the language is set to German, that would probably sound weird, right? So making sure that there's a title for the document and the language is set correctly, those are your two that are required. The other stuff is nice to have. Now, similarly, bookmarks, right? There's a question mark next to that because are they required or not? Oh, by the way, sorry, with metadata. So I mentioned title and language are required. HHS does require author, subject, and keywords as well. So if you need to comply with the HHS standard, then those are requirements, whereas the other standards, they're just kind of nice to haves. So bookmarks. Do you add them or not? Generally, the rule is if you've got a document longer than 9 pages, then add the bookmarks, right? Bookmarks make it easier for people to navigate through the document to more quickly and easily find the information that they want to read, right? Now, bookmarks work a lot like heading levels do for people who are using a screen reader, right? So somebody who's using a screen reader can bring up a list of headings in the document and navigate through that list of headings until they hear the heading for the section that they want to know more about, and then they can navigate straight there, right? So bookmarks work in very much the same way. So it can be really handy then for the bookmarks, if you're including them, with bookmarks and the heading levels to match, right? And then, of course, another thing to consider is if you've got a really long document and you are including bookmarks, might be helpful for your end user if you set the properties of the PDF so that when somebody opens it, they can see not only the physical view of the document, but they can also see the bookmarks as well. It does a couple of things, right? First, it tells people that, hey, this document has bookmarks, right? And then they might choose to navigate over to the bookmark panel to go through those to kind of fast forward to the section that they care about, right? So not only does it provide the navigation, but when we set the PDF to open showing the bookmarks, then we're telling people right away that they are in fact there, right? So, and then of course we want to verify our document to make sure that it's standards compliant. And if you have to comply with PDF UA, then there's a flag that has to be set in the PDF as well, right? So that's kind of an overview of kind of the theory behind things. Let's check out a PDF and see how some of this really works, right? So go ahead and bring up a PDF and just got to open in Acrobat right now. So currently, I don't have this set up to display the bookmark panel. If I wanted to do that, I could navigate to the properties for the document. And in the initial view tab, it sets the navigation tab right now is set to page only. But if I wanted to set this so that the bookmarks panel and the page open, then I would choose that and then hit OK. And then the bookmark panel would open when I open the PDF. Now, of course, there's no bookmarks here. So that would be another thing to address. And I could add them here, and there's a number of ways to do that in Acrobat. Frankly, I think there's a faster and easier way to add them in CommonLook. So I'm going to choose that route instead. But so the other metadata things, I'll just use a keyboard shortcut here to get me back to metadata in Acrobat. The title, author, subject, and keywords, I'm not going to worry about providing those because I'm not going to try to comply with HHS for today. The initial view, and then in the advanced tab in Acrobat, this is where you would set the language to English, right? We can do that here, or of course we can do this in CommonLook as well. Important to keep in mind that, you know, when we talk about checkers and testing everything to make sure that it's really accurate, things that will slide by the Acrobat full check, if you don't have the property set to display the title, then that will come up as a failure in Acrobat. But if you have anything at all for the title of your document and it's set to display that, then it'll automatically pass. We're going to see in CommonLook that that's going to show up as a user verification item to make sure that the title is actually accurate for the PDF that we're testing. So anyway, I was going to go ahead and open up CommonLook, and we'll check out some things in CommonLook and take this the rest of the way. When CommonLook opens, I'm going to go back to my typical workflow that we've shown in other webinars as well, where we navigate through the tags first, checking to make sure that the tags are correct for the content and they're in the correct reading order. Of course, part of your manual verification is to check out those things and obviously to make any adjustments that need to be made. So we have our document tag, and then I'm just going to use the arrow keys on my keyboard because it's easy. We've got our H1 for the title. The figure tag is highlighting the band playing on stage, so the lines, the decorative lines above are not tagged, so that's good because they're decorative. I'm also looking over the properties panel and checking the alternative text for my figure tag, which is correct, so that's good. And just continuing down the reading order, paragraph tags for the text here till I get to an H2. Paragraph tag for some couple of sentences there, and then a data table. So I'm just going to really quickly show my table editor. We've dealt with tables in other webinars, so I'm not really going to worry too much about stuff, but to check and make sure that things like the scope has been set for my header cells correctly and all of that before I worry about anything, and it's good. So I can go back to my tag tree and continue manually verifying my tags, so H2, and then paragraph, and then there's a list. Check out my list real quick and make sure that that's all put together correctly, which it is. And I can also glance over to my properties panel again and verify the list numbering value as well. Right, we've talked about that in previous webinars. The next paragraph tag, and then 3 more figure tags. They appear to be in the correct reading order. And I'm also glancing over the properties panel again for the alternative text to make sure that it's accurate for these logos that are on the page as well. Finally, the last paragraph tag with a link in it. So there's the link tag. It has alternative text. It's properly assembled with the annotation and the text inside it. And there we go. And I'm also noticing that the underline underneath the link has been artifacted. I don't need a screen reader to worry about reading that line. So our tagging is good. So then maybe even before I run my verification, I want to check out a couple of things. I'm going to navigate up to the Windows tab, and then in the ribbon, choose the button for bookmarks, right? So as we noticed in Acrobat, my document didn't have any bookmarks. I don't have any here, but I can generate them easily with CommonLook. And what CommonLook does is take the heading levels from the tag tree and creates bookmarks based on the heading levels, right? And I've got my H1 for the title of the document and then some H2s below. And so those bookmarks are then properly nested as well. That's a little bit more of a challenge doing it in Acrobat. So that's one of the reasons why I just chose to do it in CommonLook. So there's the bookmarks all taken care of. I can also, back in the Windows tab, navigate in the ribbon to the metadata panel. And where the properties panel was over on the lower right-hand side of my screen, now have the metadata panel. And I can check and make sure things like the checkbox to display the document title is checked, right? And my title and author, just like we saw from the properties in Acrobat, is set. The language is set to English, and then our compliance standards as well, right? And here's where I can set the PDF UA flag to indicate that the PDF is, in fact, PDF UA compliant. Of course, I want to check it and make sure that it is correct. So I'm going to go, as we've done in previous webinars, up to the standards panel and open up my categories of checks, if you will. ISO 32000, remember that's the standard on how to make a PDF. So I'm going to test and make sure that structurally everything is put together correctly. And then I'm going to choose PDF UA, and I'm going to choose WCAG 2.1 AA as well. Remember, for our federal government friends, if you need to comply with Section 508, which is WCAG 2.0, if your document passes against WCAG 2.1 AA, it also, by default, passes against WCAG 2.0 AA. So we're going to be Section 508 WCAG 2.0 compliant here as well by the time we're all said and done. So I'm going to go ahead and run my full validation and see how we did. Right now, when I do that, the results panel opens up as we've seen before, showing me a whole bunch of stuff that's passed and not applicable. So I'm going to go ahead and filter that out and see, do I have anything that's failed? Nope, I don't. Good for me. And then the items that require manual verification, and then any warnings that I might have, right? And it's important to keep these things in mind and to remember to check the things that, you know, automation can't necessarily verify 100% without a little bit of human intervention. The first checkpoint, now also it's important to note, I tested against 2 accessibility standards. They both have similar requirements, for example, the title and stuff like that. So I might be asked to verify things a couple of times, one for each standard, basically. So for example, this first question is asking me to verify that the document title is correct for this document, and it is. And again, here's my metadata panel where I can see there's the title right there as well, so I can mark that as passed, right? Verifying the reading order, right? This comes up asking me to make sure that the reading order is correct. That's one of the main reasons why we navigate through the tags first, checking to make sure that they're okay. So the reading order is good. Obviously, if it wasn't good, I would have stopped and fixed anything in the tags that needed to be fixed. Then we have the color checkpoint, which is long and wordy, but to paraphrase, basically, you know, are we using color or some other visual cue as the only way of conveying information, which in this document we're not, so I'm going to mark that as passed. And then I'm asked another metadata question. This is asking me to verify that the language English is appropriate for my document, and it's written in English, so it is. I can mark that as passed as well. This is a good check, by the way, you know, while you're going through the process. If you see anything and you're like, hey, wait, no, this is not written in English, then I should probably address that, right? But in this case, it's correct, so we're good. Now, as I was navigating through the tags, we touched on the figure tags for our images, and CommonLook is asking me to verify the alternative text is accurate for all of those figure tags. But I did that while I was navigating through the tag tree, so I'm actually just going to select all of these at this point, and I can change the status to passed a little bit more quickly that way. PDF UA asked me a question that WCAG doesn't, and this one is asking me to make sure that alternative text is more appropriate than actual text for the highlighted element, which is this graphic of the band playing on the stage. In fact, it's also asking me this for the other graphical elements in the document as well. The logos down at the bottom. Alternative text is more appropriate than actual text for those, so I'm going to go ahead and mark those as passed. Another PDF UA question. A figure without a caption has been detected. Please ensure that to tag a caption if it's required. Now, none of my images in this document have captions, so I can actually, I'm going to change the status on all of those to not applicable because there aren't any captions. All right. Also, similarly, the next one is asking me to make sure I've got graphics, make sure that they are tagged in the most accessible way possible, and they are. So by putting my graphics in figure tags and giving them accurate alternative text, we take care of that. The table summary is the next question that comes up, and CommonLook is asking me to verify the accuracy of the summary for the little data table we have here, ticket prices by day and category. So this is good. You can mark that as passed. From a reviewer standpoint, by the way, you may have noticed that I could set the status to failed, and I could generate my report. If I needed to send that, for example, back to somebody else who was going to be doing the remediation work, I could mark something as failed and even provide a comment for why I said it failed so that they would know what needed to be addressed with it. The next checkpoint then is asking me to make sure that the table is well formatted, right? Well organized into rows and columns and so on. It is, it's good. I opened up my table editor and checked that all out. So that's all set. And then my list numbering value, which we already talked about in previous webinars as well. It's set to circle for my bulleted list. So I'm in good shape. Now we're being asked to verify that the reading order is accurate for the annotation in my link tag, and it is, so that's fine. Another thing that I did when I was opening up the tags is checking the reading order to make sure that everything was good. Right? Then this question here for PDF UA asking me if the annotation is used for visual formatting, and making sure that it's tagged correctly and so on. I'm going to say not applicable here because this is a link annotation. It's not an annotation used for formatting, so we're okay in this situation. And then a couple more for the links, asking me to verify the alternative text for the link tag and also the contents for the link annotation. Both of these I glanced at while I was navigating through the tags. They're good. I can mark those as pass. All right, so we get into a little bit of redundancy now with WCAG 2.1 AA. And by the way, just in case you were wondering, why did he choose both standards? Because in some of the webinars that we've given, somebody has asked, hey, why didn't you do PDF UA, or why didn't you do WCAG? So I just thought, you know what, this is our last webinar in the series. We'll go big. We'll do both. So there you go. So this now for WCAG is asking me to verify the alternative text for all of my graphics. Now, of course, this is my third time checking it out, so I can mark those as passed. Similarly, for the links, verifying the alternative text for the link tag as well as the contents for the annotation. The list numbering value, again, comes up in WCAG. Hey, please make sure that that's okay. So there we go. And then similarly for our table summary, which we've already checked out as well. So I'll mark these as passed. Just like in PDF UA, we've got the color checkpoint, right? Make sure that color or other visual cues aren't the only way that information is conveyed. So we're good there. Again, with our contrast checkpoint, just like PDF UA, asking us to make sure that the contrast ratios are correct and so on. So we can mark this as passed. Now, WCAG 2.1 has an additional contrast checkpoint that PDF UA doesn't have, and this is asking to verify that the contrast ratio between the graphics and adjacent colors is at least 3:1, right? And of course, this is asking me for all of the graphics on the page, but they're all good. So again, I can bulk select and change the status to passed. Just like we saw with PDF UA, asking me to verify that the document title is correct, and it is, so I can mark this as passed again. And our language checkpoint, right? It's still in English, which is still correct, so we're good to go there. And then PDF UA and WCAG 2.1 both are throwing the same warning at me. If I show the dialog box here, it's saying page 1 contains content but does not define header or footer pagination artifacts. If you'd like more information on header or footer pagination artifacts, I think that was the last webinar that we did last week. So feel free to reach out to us if you missed that one and you want access to it. But we don't have any footers or headers in our document, so I'm going to mark this as not applicable. And I'm going to do the same thing for WCAG. It's the same question. It gets the same answer. So there we go. So we've made sure that we've tested everything, not only walking through the tag tree, making sure that was all good, making sure that our bookmarks were good, but also all of the things that we needed to manually verify to make sure that we were addressing really everything, right? So then the next thing would be to set my filter back to all so that I'm showing all of the checkpoints for both of the standards, or for all the standards that I chose, all three, right? ISO 32000, as well as PDF UA and WCAG 2.1. And then I can generate my compliance report, right? Which is going to be saved to my desktop because that's where my PDF is. It's going to save it as an accessible HTML file. So as mentioned before, kind of important, right? You got to make sure that your documents are compliant, but you know, it'd be a good idea that your report is compliant as well and is accessible as well, so that people don't have problems reading your report. So I'll go ahead and hit save. And there we go. And I think we've looked at compliance reports in previous webinars as well. So that's some of the things to keep in mind as you know, during your kind of final checks, if you will. Maybe walk the tag tree one more time. Check your bookmarks and see. Now, if your PDF came in with bookmarks, but then through the remediation process, you change your heading levels and you want your bookmarks and your headings to match, then delete the bookmarks that are there and regenerate them, right? And of course, then run your verification. Make sure that you're addressing all of the things that require manual verification, as well as the things that, you know, automation can test. We'll go back to our PowerPoint. open up for questions and answers. I've seen some questions or comments popping into the Q&A pod while we've been going through this. Just as a review, remember that we will email the link to the video recording, the captioned recording of today's time together. So be on the lookout for that. Check out what we have coming up on the calendar on our website. The URL https://common-look.com/on-demand-video-webinars, right? And should you need to reach out to us or want to reach out to us after the fact, feel free to send a note over to sales@commonlook.com. I'll check out the questions in the Q&A pod, see what we've got there. If we don't get your question, or if you think of one after the fact, then please reach out to us again at sales@commonlook.com. So how do you know, the first question here, how do you know if the title is set to be displayed when checking the metadata, right? In Acrobat, in the initial view tab, right, where I opened up the drop-down menu to show, to display the bookmark pane as well as the page, further down in that panel, there's a checkbox for displaying it's a drop-down menu to display the title as opposed to the file name. And of course, in CommonLook, I showed it, it was over in the metadata, the checkbox up at the top to display document title. If that's checked in CommonLook, then you know you're good. All right, so actually I was hoping you could show how to make sure the title is set to be displayed in Adobe. I can do that, yep, so I'll go ahead and save and close my changes to my PDF, and then just navigate really quickly to my desktop and reopen the PDF. Notice that when you close CommonLook, right, it closes Acrobat as well. So in Acrobat, if I open up the metadata panel, when I go to initial view, there's a drop-down menu for file name or document title. You want that to be set to document title. So hopefully that helps. What would an example of an annotation, what would be an example of an annotation used for formatting? There's a variety from pop-up annotations and so on. There's actually lots of annotations that can be used in PDFs. A video or an embedded audio or video technically comes in as an annotation as well, right? So there's lots of annotations. We're probably typically most familiar with those that are for forms or links, right? Widget annotations for forms or link annotations. But yeah, so you know, comments and just other, there's lots of examples of annotations used for formatting. If you want to get more technically into the weeds, feel free to reach out to us at sales@commonlook.com, and we can go deeper into the technical weeds if you want to. How do you add the document tag? Do you also have to add this tag on forms? So yeah, the document tag, you need to add the document tag for any document that's a full and complete document, right? So if you have a form that is a full and complete document, then yes, you would want your first tag in the tree to be the document tag, and then everything goes inside it. How do you add it? In CommonLook, you select the tag root, open up a context menu, and choose Add Document Tag, and it puts it in. A little bit harder to do in Acrobat. You've got to create the tag and then manually put stuff inside it and so on. Depends on which platform you're using. A quick overview of the compliance report. Sure, let me navigate to my desktop, and here's the report, again, as an accessible HTML. I'm going to close the Q&A pod to get it out of my way. So here's the file name and today's date and the testing information, and then how we did against ISO 32000 with all of the checkpoints and any comments or what the status is. If there's no comment in the CommonLook report, by the way, then this is all stuff that CommonLook has automatically tested and verified that it's okay or not applicable. And then we get into our accessibility results. So first, PDF UA. Here's all of the checkpoints in PDF UA, how we did, whether it's passed or not applicable. Anything that I manually passed, CommonLook will automatically put into the report verification results set by user. So there's a little bit of an accountability piece there too, indicating what manually was addressed, and if there's no comment, then that's stuff that, again, CommonLook has automatically taken care of. If I scroll down further, then after all of the PDF UA stuff, lots of checkpoints in PDF UA, then we will get down to our WCAG 2.1 AA results, and the same thing, all of the checkpoints, how we did, and whether it was manually passed or if CommonLook has addressed it. Go ahead and open up the Q&A pod again. Thank you, you're welcome. Should table data in a data cell be nested in a P tag or not? Good question. Really, at the end of the day, for a screen reader, it doesn't matter, especially if your data is short within your data cell. Now, if you have a super complex table with lots and lots of paragraphs of text, which is technically the data in a cell, then yeah, it might be a good idea to use individual paragraph tags within your TD, but doesn't, it's not actually required. All right, looks like that's all of the questions that are in the Q&A pod. Leave it open for another minute maybe, and in case anything drops in, or if you think of a question after the fact, again, please feel free to reach out to us at sales@commonlook.com. Thank you for tuning in to our webinar series. I believe this is the last one in our spring webinar series, so please go to our website and look for the on-demand video webinars to find any of the ones that we've previously held, or reach out to us and find out what we have coming up next. One more question came in to Q&A pod real quick. Can you briefly explain when to use an artifact page versus pagination versus layout type? We did the pagination headers and footers and pagination and so on. I think that was the last webinar that we did as far as the types of artifacts, right? Long story short, you know, if something's a layout, for example, formatting lines and, you know, print lines and so on and so forth, those don't need to be in pagination artifacts. Really what matters is your headers or footers being in header or footer pagination artifacts, especially things like page numbers, so that if somebody's using a screen reader, they can access those page numbers if they want to, even though they've been untagged. Other than that, not really big impact on your artifact container types and subtypes. So hopefully that helps. Again, feel free to reach out to us at sales@commonlook.com should you want to go more technically into the weeds or want some clarification. But again, thanks everybody for tuning in, and hopefully you have found the webinars in our series helpful. Thank you, take care, stay healthy, stay safe. Reach out to us at sales@commonlook.com if you have any questions or anything moving forward. Thanks everybody, take care.